Chapter 1. The Lady in the Fog. The fog crept through the streets like a veil of mystery, muffling the sounds of the city that never sleeps. It was a cold night, and the air seemed heavy with whispered secrets. On the third floor of an old building, Detective Jack Sullivan sat in his office, illuminated only by the faint glow of a desk lamp. The aroma of cigarette smoke mingled with the smell of cheap whiskey filling his glass. He was studying the files of a cold case, the ticking of the clock on the wall filling the silence. Jack was a man marked by time and life. His tall, lean figure wore a worn-out suit, a felt hat hanging over his tired eyes, and a scruffy beard giving him a charmingly disheveled look. He had piercing eyes that could see through lies and an indomitable spirit, forged in the harsh streets of the city. As he gazed at a faded photo, the office door slowly opened with a creak of protest. A female silhouette emerged from the fog of the hallway. Jack looked up, curious. The woman entered, her figure wrapped in a long, elegant coat. She removed her hat, revealing dark hair like midnight and eyes that shone with a mix of fear and determination. Detective Sullivan? Her voice was soft but firm, with a touch of restrained desperation. "May I speak with you?" Jack gestured to the chair in front of him. "Of course. Have a seat." She settled in, delicately removing her gloves and placing them on her lap. "My name is Catherine Devereaux. I'm here because I need your help. My brother, Thomas, is missing." She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sure he's in danger." Jack observed Catherine closely. She was a woman of class, but there was something in her eyes that revealed a hard life. "Tell me everything, Miss Devereaux. Leave nothing out." Catherine took a deep breath before beginning. "Thomas is a brilliant mathematician. He was working on a secret project, something related to the government. 2 weeks ago, he disappeared. The last time I saw him was at a bar, a place called the Midnight Lounge. Since then, I've heard nothing from him." Jack made a mental note. The Midnight Lounge was a well-known gathering spot for people of dubious character. "You mentioned he was working on a secret project. Any idea what it was about?" She shook her head, frustrated. "Not exactly. Thomas was always reserved about his work. But he did mention something about uncovering a fraudulent scheme, something big involving powerful people." "Powerful people, you say?" Jack leaned back in his chair, scratching his chin. "That sounds dangerous. Any clue who might be involved?" Catherine looked directly into Jack's eyes. "He mentioned a name, Victor Malone. I know he's a dangerous gangster, known as Cobra." Jack felt a chill down his spine at the mention of the name. Victor Cobra Malone was a feared name in the city, a man known for his cruelty and influence. "This changes everything. I'll need more information. What else can you tell me about your brother? Friends, habits, places he frequented?" She hesitated again, as if choosing the right words was crucial. "Thomas didn't have many friends. He was a solitary man, dedicated to his work. But he trusted me. Before he disappeared, he left a folder in my apartment, saying it was crucial for his safety." "And this folder, where is it now?" Jack asked, already anticipating the answer. "Safe," Catherine replied. "But I don't know what to do with it. That's why I came to you." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "I'll need to see that folder. But for now, you need to stay safe. If Malone is involved, you could be in danger too." Catherine smiled for the first time since she entered the office. "Thank you, Detective. I trust you." She stood up, ready to leave, but Jack stopped her with one last question. "One more thing, Miss Devereaux. Why did you choose to come to me?" She looked at him, determination shining in her eyes. "Because you're the best detective, and I believe you can find my brother." With those words, she disappeared into the fog, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and a new puzzle to solve. He looked out the window, seeing the city lights flickering in the distance, as if the city itself was conspiring against him. Jack knew this would be a dangerous journey, but he was ready to face anything. After all, he was Jack Sullivan, the detective who defied the odds. Chapter 2. The Lost Case. The city was still shrouded in fog as Jack Sullivan left his office, the timid sun beginning to illuminate the shadowy streets. He needed answers, and the first place to look was the Midnight Lounge, the last place Thomas Devereaux had been seen. The Midnight Lounge was a hidden bar, known only to those seeking trouble or wanting to avoid it. The discreet facade concealed the true nature of the place. Jack pushed the heavy door open, and the muffled sounds of conversations and jazz music enveloped him immediately. He walked up to the bar, where a keen-eyed bartender was meticulously cleaning glasses. "A whiskey, please, and some information," Jack said, placing a bill on the counter. The bartender looked up, sizing Jack up for a moment before pouring the drink. "Information costs more than a whiskey, friend." Jack smiled, picking up the glass. "I'm looking for a man named Thomas Devereaux. They say he frequented this place." The bartender paused, thoughtful. "Ah, yes, the mathematician. He was here a few weeks ago. A reserved type, always seemed to be pondering something heavy." He leaned in closer. "I heard he was getting involved with some dangerous people. Victor Cobra Malone, perhaps?" Jack ventured, watching the bartender's reaction. The bartender paled slightly at the name. "I don't know anything about that. All I know is he left here one night and never came back." He glanced around, ensuring no one was paying attention. "But I heard about a fight that night. Malone's people were here. Might have something to do with your friend's disappearance." Jack nodded, thanking him for the information. He looked around, noticing a burly man sitting in a dark corner of the bar, watching him intently. He decided to approach. "Seems you're interested in my conversation," Jack said, sitting at the table uninvited. The man let out a low laugh. "Who wouldn't be? This place thrives on gossip and secrets. But you're messing with dangerous stuff, detective. Malone doesn't like curious people." "And you, who are you?" Jack asked straightforwardly. "Name's Tony, and let's say I know the things that go on around here." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with restrained malice. Thomas Devereaux was onto something big, something that could take down a lot of powerful people. That's why Malone got him. "Where is he now?" Jack asked, feeling he was getting closer to the truth. Tony shook his head. "I don't know, but I heard he was taken to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. If you want to stay alive, I'd suggest you stay away from this. Malone doesn't play around." Jack stood up, leaving a generous bill on the table. "Thanks for the advice, Tony, but staying out of trouble has never been my strong suit." As he left the bar, Jack felt the weight of the new knowledge. Thomas was in serious trouble, and the only way to find him was to confront Victor Malone head-on. He knew he needed more information before facing such a dangerous enemy. He decided to visit an old friend who now worked at the police station, Sergeant Mike Thompson. They had a long history, full of solved cases and some unspoken grudges. When Jack entered the station, Thompson was busy with piles of paperwork, but he looked up when he saw Jack. "Sullivan, what brings you here at this hour?" Thompson asked, standing up to greet him. "I need information, Mike. I'm on the trail of Victor Malone, and I think he's involved in Thomas Devereaux's disappearance. I need to know everything you have on him," Jack said, getting straight to the point. Thompson sighed, grabbing a folder full of notes and reports. "Malone's a big fish, Jack. We've been trying to get him for years, but he always slips away. They say he has powerful people protecting him." He opened the folder, revealing photos and documents. "This is the warehouse where we think he hides his businesses, but no one's ever managed to get enough evidence to raid the place." Jack looked at the photos, feeling the adrenaline surge. "Thanks, Mike. This helps a lot." He patted his friend's shoulder before leaving. With the information in hand, Jack knew the next step would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. He had to find Thomas before it was too late. As he walked through the streets, the fog began to lift, revealing a city hiding more secrets than he could imagine. And Jack was determined to uncover every one of them. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. The clock struck midnight as Jack Sullivan left the Midnight Lounge, the cold night air biting at his skin. He had discovered that Thomas Devereaux had been meeting with shady figures, including the notorious gangster Victor Cobra Malone. The revelation added a new weight to the case, But Jack knew he needed more information. He headed to the darkest district of the city, a place where shadows moved with malicious intent. In the heart of this district, Jack found himself standing before an old, abandoned warehouse, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. This was one of the places mentioned by the bartender and confirmed by his old friend, Sergeant Mike Thompson. It was time to investigate. As he approached the warehouse, Jack heard the sound of quick footsteps behind him. He turned, instinctively placing his hand under his coat, ready to draw his gun. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in a dark coat with anxious eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, wait." The voice was familiar, and Jack relaxed as he recognized Catherine Devereaux. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" "I told you to stay safe," Jack said with a tone of concern. She shook her head, determined. "I couldn't just sit around while you risked your life to find my brother. I brought the folder Thomas left with me. Maybe it will help." Jack took the folder from her hands, his fingers briefly brushing hers. He opened it, revealing a series of complex notes and graphs that made little sense at first glance. "I need time to decipher this, but it could hold the key to finding Thomas." Jack closed the folder, his eyes meeting Catherine's. "Now you need to leave. This is too dangerous." Before she could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the warehouse. Jack pulled Catherine into a dark corner, both watching in silence. Two men appeared, speaking in low voices. "Do you think he'll come?" asked one, a tall, muscular man with a scar on his face. "He'll come, and when he does, Malone wants us to take care of him," the other man replied, malice clear in his voice. Jack exchanged a significant look with Catherine. "Stay here and keep quiet. I'll handle them." Carefully, Jack crept through the shadows, approaching the men. He knew he had to be quick and silent. As he got close enough, he launched himself at the nearest man, immobilizing him with a precise blow. The other turned, drawing a gun, but Jack was faster, disarming him and knocking him out with a well-placed punch. "Let's go, Catherine. We need to get out of here," Jack whispered, returning to where she was hiding. As they ran to safety, Jack knew time was running out. The clues were starting to come together, but he needed to act quickly before Malone discovered he was on his trail. Later, in Jack's office, he began to decipher Thomas's notes from the folder. Catherine watched, anxiety clear on her face. "What does all this mean, Jack?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack looked at her, his eyes shining in the dim light of the desk lamp. Thomas was investigating a massive financial fraud. He was close to uncovering something big, something that could destroy Malone and his network of corruption. That's why he was taken. "So, what do we do now?" Catherine asked, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. Jack smiled, though tired. "We find him, and we take Malone down once and for all." With a renewed sense of purpose, Jack and Catherine prepared for the next phase of the investigation. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the past, and they were determined to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Chapter 4: Intrigue and Deception. The clock on the wall of Jack Sullivan's office read 3 in the morning. The detective sat in his chair, his tired eyes fixed on Thomas Devereaux's notes. Catherine slept on the sofa beside him, exhausted by the previous night's events. The atmosphere was heavy with a profound silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of night traffic. Jack knew that Thomas's notes held the key to unraveling the mystery. He studied the complex graphs and formulas, trying to connect the dots. Every line, every number seemed to tell a story of corruption and betrayal, a scheme so vast it reached the highest echelons of power. Suddenly, a name jumped off the pages: Jonathan Hartman. Jack recognized the name immediately. Hartman was an influential politician, known for his charming smile and empty promises. He had deep ties to Victor Malone's businesses. Jack knew he needed to talk to Hartman, but it would require caution and a well-thought-out strategy. The following morning, Jack left Catherine under Mike Thompson's protection and went to meet Hartman. The politician was in his luxurious office, surrounded by expensive artwork and an air of superiority. Jack entered unannounced, his presence disrupting the controlled atmosphere of the room. "Mr. Hartman, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice firm and unyielding. Hartman looked up from his papers, a momentary expression of surprise crossing his face before being replaced by a fake smile. "Detective Sullivan, to what do I owe the honor?" "Thomas Devereaux, I know you're involved in what happened to him, and I know you and Malone are behind this fraudulent scheme." Jack fired off, wasting no time. Hartman stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Careful with the accusations, Sullivan. You have no proof." "Not yet," Jack replied, stepping closer. "But I'm close, and you know it. So, tell me where he is before things get worse for you." Hartman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of disdain. "You're playing with fire, detective. Malone won't like knowing you're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Before Jack could respond, 2 security guards entered the room. Hartman gestured, and they grabbed Jack by the arms, dragging him out. As he was thrown onto the sidewalk, Jack heard Hartman's voice echoing in his mind. "You're getting into a game you can't win." Jack stood up, dusting off his coat. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew he needed to be more cautious. He decided to return to the office and gather more information before making his next move. Back at the office, he found Catherine awake, anxiety etched on her face. "Did you get anything?" she asked, her voice filled with hope and fear. Jack nodded. "Hartman is definitely involved. He confirmed it, even if indirectly. But we need more evidence before we can do anything." Catherine looked at Jack, her eyes shining with determination. "So, what do we do now?" Jack sat at the table, his fingers drumming on the wooden surface. "We keep following the clues in Thomas's notes. They'll lead us to the next step. And when we have enough proof, we'll take down Hartman and Malone once and for all." As the night wore on, Jack and Catherine worked together, analyzing every detail of the notes. They uncovered references to suspicious bank transactions and contacts in various parts of the city. Each discovery brought them closer to Thomas and the dismantling of the corruption network. In the early hours of the morning, Jack received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was low and urgent. "Sullivan, if you want to find Thomas Devereaux, go to the port tomorrow at midnight. But come alone." The line went dead before Jack could respond. He looked at Catherine, who was beside him. "It seems we have an appointment at the port tomorrow. It might be a trap, but it's our best chance." Catherine took Jack's hand, mutual trust growing between them. "We'll bring him back, Jack, and we'll put an end to this corruption." With a new plan in place, Jack knew the next night could be decisive. The port would be the stage for a confrontation, and he needed to be prepared for anything. The truth was getting closer, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. The Hidden Truth. The night was dark and cold as Jack Sullivan parked his car at the port. The dark waters of the river reflected the moonlight, creating a scene of mystery and tension. He looked around, making sure no one was following him, before stepping out of the car and walking towards the abandoned warehouses. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and rust. Jack knew this meeting could be a trap, but he had no choice. He needed to find Thomas Devereaux and put an end to Victor Malone and Jonathan Hartman's scheme. As he approached the meeting point, he heard footsteps echoing in the dark alleys. The tension mounted with each step. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall man with a hood covering his face. He gestured for Jack to follow him. Jack placed his hand on his holster, prepared for anything, and followed the man through a maze of rusty containers. Finally, they arrived at an isolated warehouse. The man stopped and turned to Jack, revealing a face marked by worry. "Detective Sullivan?" he asked in a whisper. "That's me. Who are you?" Jack replied, his hand still near his gun. "My name is Peter. I worked with Thomas Devereaux." Peter looked around, as if fearing he was being watched. "Thomas trusted me. He gave me some information before he disappeared. I thought you might need it." Jack relaxed a bit, though he remained cautious. "Where is Thomas now?" "I don't know. He was taken by Malone's men. But before he was caught, Thomas left me a copy of the documents he was investigating. They prove the connection between Malone and Hartman in a money laundering scheme. Peter handed an envelope to Jack. Jack took the envelope, feeling the weight of the evidence in his hands. This is enough to bring them down. But I need to find Thomas. Where could they have taken him? Peter hesitated, then spoke urgently. I heard there's a hideout on the outskirts of the city, an old abandoned mansion. Malone uses it for business that needs total discretion. Thomas might be there. Jack nodded, tucking the envelope inside his coat. Thank you, Peter. You did the right thing. Peter gave one last look around, fear clear in his eyes. Be careful, detective. Malone is a dangerous man, and Hartman has more power than you can imagine. Jack watched as Peter disappeared into the shadows, then returned to his car, the engine roaring as he drove towards the abandoned mansion. The road was winding, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The mansion came into view, an imposing and decaying structure exuding an air of abandonment and mystery. Jack parked the car at a safe distance and approached on foot, moving silently through the shadows. The sound of voices came from inside, indicating that the place was not as empty as it seemed. He found a slightly open window and peeked inside. Several armed men were patrolling the interior. Jack needed to be careful. He circled the mansion, looking for a less guarded entrance. Finally, he found a slightly open back door and slipped inside, gun in hand. The corridors were dark and silent, except for the distant sound of voices. Jack followed the sound, advancing cautiously. He reached a large room, where Victor Malone sat in a luxurious chair, smoking a cigar. Beside him, Thomas Devereaux was tied up and clearly beaten, but alive. You really thought you could take us down, Devereaux? Malone said, his voice dripping with disdain. No one messes with Malone and gets away with it. Thomas looked up, his face marked by pain and despair, but his eyes lit up with a flash of determination upon seeing Jack entering the room. Jack! Thomas murmured, his voice weak. Malone stood up, his surprise quickly turning to anger. Sullivan, how did you? Before he could finish, Jack fired, hitting Malone's gun and sending it flying from his hand. A gunfight ensued, with Jack dodging and shooting, taking out Malone's henchmen one by one. Finally, Malone was on the ground, wounded and powerless. Jack approached Thomas, cutting the ropes that bound him. Let's get you out of here, Jack said, helping Thomas to his feet. With Thomas leaning on his shoulder, Jack exited the mansion, facing the last obstacles until they reached his car. He placed Thomas in the back seat and sped away, leaving the mansion and its dangers behind. At Jack's office, Catherine waited anxiously. When Jack entered with Thomas, she ran to embrace her brother, tears of relief streaming down her face. You did it, Jack. You brought him back, she said, gratitude overflowing in her words. Jack nodded, exhausted but relieved. It's not over yet. We have the evidence and Thomas's testimony. Now, it's time to bring down Malone and Hartman once and for all. With Thomas safe and the evidence in hand, Jack knew the endgame was near. The truth was about to be revealed, and justice would finally be served. Chapter 6. Danger Lurking. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky a blood-red hue as Jack Sullivan parked his car in front of the police station. He, Thomas, and Catherine had spent the night gathering evidence and preparing for the next phase, taking down Victor Malone and Jonathan Hartman. With the evidence in hand, Jack knew he needed the help of his old friend, Sergeant Mike Thompson. Jack entered the station, the familiar environment providing him a rare moment of calm. He went straight to Thompson's office, finding the sergeant hunched over a pile of reports. Seeing Jack, Thompson stood up, surprised and relieved. Jack, you did it! Thompson exclaimed, shaking the detective's hand. Not alone. Thomas and Catherine helped a lot, Jack replied, pulling a thick envelope from inside his coat and handing it to Thompson. Here's the evidence. It links Malone and Hartman to a money laundering scheme and other crimes. We need to act fast. Thompson opened the envelope and examined the documents, his face hardening as he read. This is more than enough. We'll need a warrant and support to arrest these guys. The sooner the better, Jack said. Malone and Hartman will realize we're close and will try to escape or retaliate. Thompson nodded, picking up the phone to start mobilizing the team. Meanwhile, Jack returned to the waiting room where Thomas and Catherine were waiting. Thomas was still bruised, but his determination was palpable. "Are we going to get those bastards, Jack?" Thomas asked, his voice firm despite the recent hardships. "We will, Thomas," Jack replied, placing a hand on the mathematician's shoulder. "That's a promise." Hours later, the operation was underway. Police officers gathered at the station, armed and ready for action. Thompson coordinated everything with military precision. Jack, Thomas, and Catherine watched the commotion, a mix of anxiety and hope on their faces. "Everything is ready. Let's get these guys," Thompson said, joining the group. "Jack, you're coming with us. You know these men better than anyone." The team split into two groups, one to apprehend Malone at his hideout and another to capture Hartman in his luxurious mansion. Jack was with the group going after Malone, knowing the confrontation would be more dangerous there. The drive to Malone's hideout was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the sound of the police radio. When they arrived, Jack led the group, moving silently through the area toward the warehouse. They entered, guns drawn, ready for anything. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm, but Jack knew it was only the calm before the storm. He signaled for the officers to spread out and start the search. As they advanced through the dark corridors, Jack heard a subtle noise behind a closed door. He gestured for one of the officers to open the door, and when they did, they found Malone surrounded by his henchmen. A frantic gunfight ensued, bullets flying as Jack and the officers faced fierce resistance from Malone's men. In the chaos, Jack managed to get close to Malone, who was trying to escape through a side exit. With a swift move, Jack disarmed the gangster, pointing his gun directly at him. "It's over, Malone. There's nowhere to run," Jack said, his voice firm and determined. Malone laughed, a bitter, desperate laugh. "You think this ends me, Sullivan? There will always be someone else to take my place." "Maybe, but today is your day to pay for your crimes," Jack replied, handcuffing Malone as the officers secured the area. As Malone was taken away, Jack felt a deep sense of relief. He knew the other team was on their way to arrest Hartman, and that justice was finally being served. Hours later, back at the station, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine awaited news from Thompson's team. Finally, the sergeant entered, a satisfied smile on his face. "We got Hartman. He was trying to flee but wasn't fast enough," Thompson said. "Good job, Jack. You did it." Catherine ran to hug Jack, tears of relief and gratitude in her eyes. Thomas shook the detective's hand, his voice full of emotion. "Thank you, Jack. You saved us and brought justice." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of a duty fulfilled. "There's still much to do, but today we won a big battle." As the sun rose again, illuminating the city, Jack knew the fight against corruption continued. But with allies like Thomas, Catherine, and Thompson by his side, he was ready to face any challenge. Chapter 7: The Last Refuge. The morning brought a sense of relief, but also of unease. Though Malone and Hartman were behind bars, Jack Sullivan knew that the network of corruption wouldn't dismantle so easily. The collected evidence was enough to keep the two out of circulation for a long time, but Jack had a nagging feeling there were more secrets buried, something Thomas Devereaux could shed light on. Jack and Catherine took Thomas to the detective's office, a place that now felt like a safe haven compared to the dangerous streets outside. Thomas, still recovering from his injuries, sank heavily into a chair, exhausted but determined. "Thomas, we need more details about what you discovered. We know Malone and Hartman were laundering money, but there has to be more behind it," Jack said, handing Thomas a glass of water. Thomas nodded, taking a sip before responding. "You're right, Jack. The scheme was much bigger than just money laundering. They were using diverted funds to finance criminal operations, bribe officials, and even manipulate elections. I was close to uncovering the full extent of it when I was caught." Catherine, sitting beside Thomas, looked at her brother with concern. "And what about the others involved? Are there more names? More people we need to bring to justice? Thomas grabbed a notepad and began scribbling frantically. Yes, there are many others. People in positions of power, including city council members, influential businessmen, and even some within the security forces. They have a well-established network covering their operations. Jack watched Thomas's notes, feeling the urgency to act. We need a plan to expose them all. We can't rely solely on the local police, considering some might be compromised. And if Malone and Hartman fall, these others will try to cover their tracks quickly. I know someone who can help, Thomas said, looking directly at Jack. My former professor, Armand Boucher. He's a genius at decoding and has contacts in various federal agencies. If we can get this evidence to him, he can help us dismantle the entire network. Jack nodded, seeing the logic in Thomas's plan. Then let's find him. Where can we find Boucher? He lives reclusively, but I know where he is. I'll guide you there, Thomas replied, struggling to his feet. The journey to Armand Boucher's house was long and winding, taking them out of the city through isolated roads and dense forests. Finally, they arrived at a cabin hidden among the trees, a place that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Boucher was an elderly man, with disheveled white hair and eyes that sparkled with the wisdom of many years. He greeted the group with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Thomas, I thought I'd never see you again, Boucher said, embracing his former student. And who are your friends? This is Jack Sullivan, the detective who saved me, and my sister, Catherine, Thomas explained. We need your help, Professor. We have evidence of a criminal network, but we need more information to take down everyone involved. Boucher led them to his workshop, a space cluttered with books, computers, and decoding equipment. He took the documents Thomas brought and began studying them meticulously. Fascinating, Boucher murmured, typing furiously on an old computer. These codes and transactions are complex, but I can see the pattern. They felt invincible, which made them careless in some areas. I'll need a few hours to analyze everything. While Boucher worked, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine waited anxiously. The tension in the air was palpable, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, Boucher stood up, a satisfied smile on his face. I've managed to decipher most of it. These documents not only confirm money laundering but also reveal plans for future crimes and the names of all involved. We have everything we need to present to the federal authorities. Jack felt a deep sense of relief. Excellent work, Professor. Now we need to ensure this information gets to those who can act on it. Boucher nodded. I have reliable contacts in the Federal Investigative Agency. I'll personally ensure these documents get into the right hands. As Boucher prepared to leave, Jack looked at Thomas and Catherine. We're close to the end, but we still have to be cautious. These men won't give up easily. Thomas agreed. But with this evidence, we can finally bring justice and dismantle this network of corruption. Catherine, holding her brother's hand, smiled for the first time in days. Together, we'll make it. With Boucher's help, the network of corruption was about to be dismantled. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, and Jack knew that despite the dangers still ahead, they were on the right path to justice. Chapter 8. The Enemy's Lair. Jack Sullivan felt adrenaline pumping as he drove down the dark road leading to the city's outskirts. Beside him, Thomas and Catherine were tense but determined. With Armand Boucher's help, they had deciphered the documents revealing the full extent of Malone and Hartman's criminal network. Now, it was time to confront those involved and ensure justice was served. Malone's hideout, an abandoned warehouse by the river, was their destination. Jack knew the operation would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. They had to face Malone head-on to dismantle his empire once and for all. We're close, Jack said, eyes fixed on the road. Everyone ready? Thomas nodded, his jaw clenched. Let's finish this. Catherine squeezed her brother's hand. I'm with you. Jack parked the car a safe distance from the warehouse. They exited quietly, moving through the shadows as they approached the building. The place was dimly lit, but they could see Malone's henchmen patrolling the area. We need to be quick and precise. Catching them by surprise is our best chance, Jack whispered. They split up, each taking a strategic position around the warehouse. Jack signaled for Thomas and Catherine to wait while he approached the main entrance. Using a tool to unlock the door, he slipped inside quietly, senses on high alert. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of stacked boxes and narrow corridors. Jack moved carefully, avoiding making any noise. He spotted two henchmen talking near one of the main pillars. With quick and precise movements, Jack knocked both out before they could react. Signaling for Thomas and Catherine to join him, Jack continued through the warehouse. Finally, they reached a large room where Victor Malone was surrounded by his trusted men. In the center of the room was a table covered with documents and money. Well, Sullivan, you managed to find me," Malone said, rising from his chair with a sarcastic smile. "But I expected no less from you." Jack pointed his gun directly at Malone. "It's over, Malone. We have all the evidence we need to bring you and your friends down. Surrender now." Malone laughed, a bitter, cold sound. "Do you really think you'll leave here alive, Sullivan? My men will take you down before you can blink." Before Jack could respond, a volley of gunfire echoed through the warehouse. Malone's henchmen started shooting, forcing Jack, Thomas, and Catherine to take cover behind boxes and pillars. The gunfight was intense, bullets whizzing through the air and shattering everything around them. "Catherine, stay down," Jack shouted, returning fire with precision. Thomas saw an opportunity and bravely advanced to disarm one of the henchmen. Amidst the chaos, he managed to grab a weapon and join Jack in the fight. The exchange of gunfire continued until, finally, Malone's henchmen were subdued. Realizing he had no escape, Malone tried to flee through a side door, but Jack was faster. With an agile move, he disarmed Malone and knocked him to the ground. "I told you it's over, Malone," Jack repeated, cuffing the gangster. As the police arrived to arrest the remaining henchmen and secure the area, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine gathered around Malone. The warehouse, now silent, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "You have no idea what you've done, Sullivan," Malone growled, hatred gleaming in his eyes. "I'm just a small piece in a much bigger game." Jack looked at him, his expression grim. "Maybe, but today you and Hartman fall. And this is just the beginning." With Malone finally captured, Jack knew the battle was far from over. They still had to ensure the evidence was used to dismantle the entire corruption network. But for now, victory was within their grasp. Back at the office, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine shared a moment of relief. They knew there was more work to be done, but capturing Malone was a significant step in the right direction. "We did it, Jack," Thomas said, his voice full of gratitude. Jack nodded, tired but satisfied. "Yes, we did, but there's still much to do. The truth is starting to emerge, and we need to make sure all of this is brought to justice." With renewed determination, Jack and his allies were ready to face any challenge that came next. The fight for truth and justice continued, but now they knew they could win. Chapter 9: Revelations and Justice. The air was thick with tension and anticipation as Jack Sullivan, Thomas Devereaux, and Catherine Devereaux arrived at the courthouse. The case against Victor Malone and Jonathan Hartman was about to begin, and the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The press swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing and reporters firing questions as the trio walked determinedly towards the entrance. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was formal and austere. Jack observed the faces of those present: journalists, curious onlookers, and those directly affected by the corruption network Malone and Hartman had built. On the defendant's bench, the two men looked more different than ever. Malone, angry and defiant. Hartman, nervous and dejected. The judge entered, and the murmurs in the room ceased instantly. The proceedings began with the presentation of the evidence, including the documents Thomas had deciphered with Armand Boucher's help. Jack watched as the prosecutor described the elaborate scheme of money laundering, bribery, and election manipulation. "Thomas Devereaux, please take the witness stand," said the prosecutor, his voice echoing through the room. Thomas stood up, visibly nervous but determined. He walked to the witness stand and took the oath to tell the truth. Jack felt a knot in his stomach, knowing how much this moment meant to Thomas. Mr. Devereaux, can you tell us about your discoveries and the role of Malone and Hartman in this scheme? The prosecutor asked. Thomas took a deep breath before beginning. I was working on a financial analysis project when I discovered suspicious patterns in several transactions. As I investigated further, I realized these transactions were linked to shell companies controlled by Victor Malone. That's when I discovered the connection to Jonathan Hartman, who used his position to protect and expand Malone's criminal operations. He explained in detail how the evidence was collected, how Boucher helped decode the codes, and how Jack risked his life to rescue him. The room was silent, everyone attentive to Thomas's words. When his testimony ended, the prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have here irrefutable evidence that the defendants were involved in criminal activities that threatened the integrity of our city. We ask that justice be served. The defense tried to contest the evidence, claiming Thomas was acting out of revenge and that the evidence was insufficient. But Thomas's determination and the clarity of the evidence were undeniable. With each argument from the defense, the prosecutor countered with concrete facts, supported by documents and testimonies. After hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. The silence was palpable as the verdict was read. Considering all the evidence presented, we find the defendants Victor Malone and Jonathan Hartman guilty of all charges, announced the jury spokesperson. The room exploded in murmurs and exclamations. Jack felt a profound relief, knowing that justice had finally prevailed. Thomas and Catherine embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. We did it, Jack, Catherine said, her voice choked with emotion. We did it. Jack nodded, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. Yes, we did. But this is just the beginning. We still have to make sure the city recovers and that no one else falls into the clutches of corruption. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered eagerly for interviews and statements. Jack, Thomas, and Catherine faced the crowd, answering questions with the confidence of those who had faced the worst and come out victorious. What's next for you? Asked a reporter, microphone extended. Jack looked at Thomas and Catherine before responding. We'll keep fighting for justice. This city deserves to know the truth, and we'll make sure everyone involved is held accountable for their crimes. As the crowd applauded, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle against Malone and Hartman had been tough, but they had triumphed. And now, with the truth finally revealed, the city had a chance to heal and move forward. Back at the office, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine celebrated with a bottle of whiskey. They knew there was still much work to be done, but for now, they could allow themselves a moment of peace and satisfaction. To the end of an era of corruption, Jack toasted, raising his glass. And to the beginning of a new era of justice. To justice, echoed Thomas and Catherine, their glasses clinking in the air. As night fell over the city, Jack knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges. But with allies like Thomas and Catherine by his side, he was prepared to face any obstacle. The fight for the truth continued, and he was determined to see justice prevail. Chapter 10, Twilight of Redemption. The city was beginning to recover from the storm of corruption that had engulfed it. With Victor Malone and Jonathan Hartman behind bars, a new sense of hope and justice permeated the streets. Jack Sullivan felt that the hardest battle was behind them, but the war against corruption was far from over. Jack's office was busier than ever. Old cases were being reopened, and new allegations were emerging as more people felt encouraged to speak up. Jack and his team worked tirelessly to ensure every thread of corruption was cut. One morning, while sipping his coffee, Jack received an unexpected visit. It was Sergeant Mike Thompson, bearing a grave expression that didn't match the recent good news. Jack, we need to talk, Thompson said, closing the door behind him. What happened, Mike? Jack asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. We've received information that some of Malone and Hartman's allies are planning retaliation. They won't let this go easily. We need to be prepared, Thompson explained. Jack nodded, knowing they couldn't let their guard down. We'll mobilize all the resources we have. We won't let these guys regain power. In the following days, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine worked together to identify and neutralize these new threats. Using the evidence and connections they had amassed, they began tracking down the remaining allies of Malone and Hartman. One night, while Jack was in the office reviewing documents, Catherine walked in with a worried expression. "Jack, I received an anonymous call. They know where we are. They're planning something big," she said, handing over a piece of paper with quick notes. Jack looked at the paper, feeling the gravity of the situation. "We need to act fast. Gather everyone. We'll prepare a defense and ensure everyone's safety." Tension mounted as the night wore on. Jack and his team were ready, waiting for any movement from Malone's allies. When the clock struck midnight, the phone rang. It was Thompson. "Jack, they're on the move. We have armed men in several points around the city. We need reinforcements immediately," Thompson said. Jack grabbed his gun and rushed to the car, followed by Thomas and Catherine. They met Thompson and his men at one of the locations pointed out in the anonymous call. An intense confrontation ensued, with gunfire echoing through the dark streets. "Watch out, Jack," Thomas shouted, pulling Jack behind cover as bullets ricocheted around them. Jack returned fire, moving with precision and skill. Each shot fired was a step closer to securing the city's safety. The battle was fierce, but eventually, Malone's allies were subdued and arrested. When the smoke of the confrontation cleared, Jack allowed himself a moment of relief. Thomas and Catherine approached, both exhausted but victorious. "We did it, Jack. They won't rise again this time," Thomas said, panting. Jack nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility finally begin to lift. "Yes, but we must remain vigilant. The fight for justice never ends." With the immediate threat neutralized, Jack, Thomas, and Catherine returned to the office. The dawn brought a new light over the city, symbolizing a fresh start. "I think it's time for a new approach," Jack said, looking at his friends. "Let's create a support network for the citizens, ensuring everyone has a safe channel to report corruption and crimes." Thomas smiled. "An excellent idea. Let's use what we've learned to strengthen the city and prevent this from happening again." Catherine agreed, her determination clear. "Count me in. We'll make sure truth and justice prevail." Together, they began implementing the plan, creating a support and transparency network that connected citizens and authorities efficiently. Over time, the city transformed, becoming a model of justice and resilience. As Jack walked through the now safer and brighter streets, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. He knew there would always be challenges, but he also knew that, with allies like Thomas and Catherine, he was prepared to face them. Jack stopped in front of the office, looking out at the horizon. The twilight of redemption had arrived, and the city was finally free of the shadows that had haunted it. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before releasing it into the wind. "To truth and justice," he murmured, before entering the office, ready for the next chapter of his life and his city.